Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am Anna Fotyga, member of the European Parliament, and together with my dear colleague Asita Kanko, member of the European Parliament representing Belgium, I have the pleasure and privilege to co-host this 2 days webinar dedicated to developments in Africa, relationship between EU and Africa, in particular focusing on situation during COVID-19 pandemics and effects on pandemic on variety of important aspect of development of all African countries. The title of our final panel is The Pandemic, Its Challenges to Democracy, Fundamental Freedoms and Good Governance. Allow me to start without much ado with presenting our distinguished panelists. There are 4 of them, and believe me, their professional bias are really outstanding. The first one is Mr. Driss Kaissi, Consul General of the Kingdom of Morocco to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. Then we have Professor Nicholas Cheeseman, Professor of Democracy and International Development at the University of Birmingham, earlier Oxford University. We have also Dr. Joseph Siegle, who is Director of Research at Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and last but absolutely not least is Dr. Mvamba Dizolele. I hope I pronounce your name properly. Briefly described as senior advisor at International Republican Institute, but actually he is also very frequent participant in variety of very prestigious media outlets and journalist, publisher, advisor, frequently testifying before both chambers of Congress and the UN Security Council. Ladies and gentlemen, let us start with short presentations of all distinguished panelists, and then we go to Q&A session and eventually second and third round of interventions. We start with Mr. Driss.
Thank you, Madam. I have to salute the ECR group. I was 6 years in Brussels, and every time you are leading the discussion and issues about Africa, mainly because of Madam the Minister and the MP, Madam Fotyga. So we have to mention that. If you allow me, I just share the screen with you, and I try to be as much as quick. The idea in principle for us, the impact, yes, sure, there is a very big impact of the pandemic on democracy, mainly on the election process in Africa. So many countries now suffer from that. There is no agenda, and depending on the management of the pandemic, there is also the impact on voting, and the people are changing their mind depending on the management of the pandemic for all other countries. And can you see my screen or not?
No, no. I'm sorry. It's we cannot see it.
I tried technically to have it, but I can continue like this. So I'm saying that there is some political events in Africa. So the impact is really big on political events in Africa. I give just some cases. The case of Ethiopia, which because of the pandemic, the election process, which was to be done on August 2020, is postponed in a later date in 2021, and still there is no precise date for that. Regarding also the process in Algeria also, we see the impact on the constitution referendum, which was a turnout of just 23% of the population eligible to election. In Uganda too, we can say that they are really goodly managing the pandemic, and there is a low date, but we can say that the government can use this for its own political agenda. So depending on the situation on the pandemic on the countries, Senegal also they are suffering from so many manifestations, and because of the pandemic too. Malawi also, we can say that the opposition could win on June 2020 because of the bad management, particularly of the pandemic. As regarding the governance, we have to say that in Africa in general, there is the issue of informal sector. So people, the fact that they are confined, they could not have the freedom to move and to look for jobs on the informal sectors. And this is a big challenge for the governments, because mainly there is no budget for these people, and as long as the pandemic continue, it may now impact negatively those countries. The issue of prisons also, they are overcrowded during this period, and civil societies also could not move for that. As regarding the press freedom, also there are some reports, mainly from Reporters Without Borders, that the health crisis impacted negatively the press freedom. As regarding my country, as you may know, we have a Center of Human Rights, which is an institution independent from the government, and they are working and appealing from the government to protect the human rights of foreigners, and particularly immigrants in Morocco, and they are trying to improve the procedures in order to permit for these people to benefit from the economic benefits in the country. So I will stop in that. Just I will add one thing, since I am as a consul here in Strasbourg. I have to say that there is an issue of students. students, African students, but also Europeans. But foreign students here in Europe, particularly in France, they are suffering a lot because of the economic situation. Normally, they have to work in parallel with their study, but they could not find works, and they could not have, even they have problems of finding their even lunches for them, because all universities are also closed, and the civil society again moved for them instead of the deficit of the government. So thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Consul. I have specific questions to you concerning your knowledge of the continent, and but also on the specific Moroccan situation. But before with this, allow me to turn to Professor Cheeseman and ask for his introductory remarks. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to make 4 key points, and hopefully I'll try and keep it fairly short. The first is that I think it's important to recognize that while democracy and democratic governments are suffering right now, this isn't just a problem for democracies. I think we see a lot of authoritarian regimes that are also struggling to respond to the pandemic. And one of the things we're seeing is a kind of increase in authoritarianism, partly because I think a lot of governments are coming under far greater strain than they have done in the past. And sometimes this is a bad thing for democracy, and it leads to further erosion of democratic gains. But there are some cases where we've actually seen, a revival of protest and demand for democracy. Think of Lebanon, think of Belarus, think of the Bobi Wine supporters in Uganda, think of the campaign against corruption in Zimbabwe. I think in some of these countries, the pandemic has actually increased the pressure on authoritarian governments. And in that sense, it could be said to have a sort of democratizing effect. So I think one of the things that we need to perhaps keep in mind is that for me, the pandemic doesn't have a kind of straightforward effect. It's basically a destabilizing force. It's putting pressure on governments, both democratic and authoritarian. And what we're seeing, whether we're seeing democratization, authoritarian regimes being overthrown, or more repression being used by the government to regain control, is a product of that great oppression and a product of the way in which COVID-19 is destabilizing governments. I think one of the really important things that we need to think about is that the worst effects of the pandemic have yet to come. We have not yet seen the most significant impacts of it on democracy in some ways. We have, for example, seen the use and abuse of COVID-19 distancing procedures is a tool to manage and control elections. We've seen that in countries like Uganda. We're going to see that in elections coming up in Zambia. But what we've often not talked about is the fact that COVID-19 is bringing in its wake an economic crisis. The crisis will be twofold. One, we see continuing problems of tourism in Africa as a result of so many countries being put on, for example, red lists by the UK government. And two, we see this mounting debt crisis. We've already seen Zambia default. Other countries, I think, will probably default over the next 24 months. So COVID-19 is generating an economic crisis that will not end with COVID-19. The debts generated during that period, the problems and unemployment generated during that period will last beyond COVID-19. And of course, the effects of COVID-19 will be longer in many sub-Saharan African states precisely because we don't have vaccines in many countries, and therefore many countries will remain on the red list for European travel, and therefore tourism won't get going again. So the iniquitous distribution of vaccines, which of course is a real threat to democratization and health across the world, and is a moral blight on Western states who are not helping other countries to access them, that will also mean there will be a prolonged economic difficulty, and that prolonged economic difficulty means that the economic and political impact of COVID will not go away anytime soon. The third thing I think it's important to say is that there aren't very many cases where I think we could say that COVID-19 on its own has led to democratic backsliding. I think what we've really seen is COVID-19 exacerbating existing trends. And we have to be realistic. These democratic issues are not to do with COVID. They are there domestically and have been for many years. For example, if you look at Freedom House, VDEM, other democracy indicators, We've been in democratic recession for a long time. This democratic recession did not start with COVID-19. By some measures, we've been in a democratic recession for 14 or 15 years, with the quality of democracy around the world falling every year for 14 or 15 years. What COVID-19 has done is exacerbate those existing tendencies. It's exacerbated the tendency of authoritarian governments to abuse people, exacerbated the tendency to censor the media, etc. And so we have to be very clear that when COVID-19 ends, and as I've already said, it might not end for many countries for another 2 or 3 years, even though it seems to be ending in some European states, even when it ends, those problems of democracy will still be there. So I think it's really important to think about COVID-19 and the pandemic, and I think this is a great panel. But one of the big challenges for us is recognizing the extent of the problem when it comes to democracy after the pandemic, and not imagining that the end of the pandemic will necessarily lead to a kind of democratic spring. Because as I said, in many countries, these are much deeper problems that run many years. My final point is that it's really important to note that the challenges that we're seeing aren't the same everywhere. You know, actually, Africa was one of the regions that didn't decline by quite as much in the last 12 months as some other regions. And we had countries like Malawi that actually managed to, first of all, have a presidential victory annulled by the courts, then a rerun victory, and then a victory in the opposition. For the opposition in that rerun, leading to a democratic and peaceful transfer of power. And according to Freedom House, Malawi was one of the only countries to go the other way and actually become more democratic during the pandemic. So I think one of the things that I've struggled with during the discussion of COVID-19 and democracy is that many people have actually talked about it as if there's a blanket effect everywhere in the world. And I think that's profoundly misleading. I think the drivers of this in Africa are very different and distinct than they are elsewhere. But it's also important to recognize that we haven't seen significant democratic decline in that many African states. And to some extent, there is an argument that actually Africa has slightly bucked the trend over the last 10 years. We haven't seen a lot of progress towards democratization, but if you look at the key democracy indices, we haven't seen a lot of movement away from it. The final thing I'll then say is something about how we go about engaging with this in a post-pandemic world, and I'll wrap up with this. I think one of the things that we need to see in the future is more humility. You know, if we think about, for example, you know, the people we have right now on the panel, if we think about the context we have in Europe, you know, I come from the UK where we struggled with Brexit and we see reports of institutional racism within our police. We have the United States that's dealt with Trump, but still has massive questions about voter suppression and the quality of its electoral registration processes. In Europe, we have concerns about democratic backsliding in countries like Hungary and Poland, etc. You know, Morocco has questions that are being asked about it of a colonial role in Western Sahara. In all of the countries in which we live and operate, there are questions about the quality of democracy. And I think one of the things that's really important in a post-pandemic world is for us to be more open and frank about those. So rather than going to Africa and saying, Africa has democratic challenges, we have solutions, let us help you, it needs to be a partnership in which we say we have democratic problems, we have democratic deficits, we recognize that you do too. Let's come together and help each other to identify how we can move forwards, rather than a kind of lecturing tone or an assumption that we have all the answers. I think that will be something that will be really important, forming new partnerships and new alliances about democratic renewal, not just in Africa, but also in Europe and North America. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Polish, so it would be long discussing Polish situation. I will skip this topic. It's not time now. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Joseph Siegle for his introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to be brief as well. I have also just 3 general remarks, which will in some ways reinforce what Nick says and maybe provide a little bit different take on a couple of trends. I think the first point is that, you know, that COVID is not having an independent effect on democracy in Africa. Indeed, COVID is happening within a broader framework of democratic duress. And indeed, you know, if you look at the trend lines in Africa, we've seen a stagnation, a plateauing over the last 10 years in real democratic gains in terms of institution development and a broader representation of democratic processes. broadly across the continent. As Nick notes, there are ups and downs, to be sure. But we've seen a plateauing, and then over the last 2 years, we've seen a significant decline. By my count, there's a net drop in democratically leaning countries by 6 from around 31 countries out of Africa's 54 to 25. And so the first time in a decade, we've seen more African countries that are leaning autocratic than democratic. So I think it's a significant shift backwards. And COVID has been a tool. COVID has been instrumentalized by a number of these authoritarian leaders to try to reduce civil liberties. And so I think we need to think about it within this broader framework, where there has already been a deterioration of protections for civil liberties and political rights. And this has happened for a variety of reasons. I would highlight that the weak development of independent institutions on the continent, which has made it easier to whittle down these checks and balances on the executive. I would highlight the evasion of term limits. We've seen a dramatic deterioration in respect to term limits since 2015. There have been 13 African countries that have evaded term limits. And this has led to perpetuation of longer regime tenures, and with it, more abuses of power. This is happening in an environment where international democratic actors have been withdrawing from their engagements in Africa on the democracy front. In the U.S. and Europe, democracy has not been a priority. It has not been. There has not been an advocacy and a standing up for democratic norms. This has been recognized and has been seized upon by those who want to, consolidate greater control, and really a reversion to big man rule in a number of African countries. And so I do think we're seeing some significant shifts that are dangerous for the continent, and COVID has been accelerating those. I think the second point I would make is that COVID is not over in globally, but it's not over in Africa. If we look at lessons from the Spanish flu of 100 years ago, it was the second and third waves that caused the most devastating effect for Africa. And a lot of these were economic effects. So they're lagged effects from the economic constraints. And Africa suffered a 3.5% contraction in its economy as a continent last year. First contraction regionally in 25 years. This year, you're supposed to see some rebounding, but it's still constrained, and it's going to vary, as Nick was saying, by country. I think in particular, we want to be paying attention to acute food insecurity that's looming on the continent. There was a major increase in the numbers of people that were facing acute food insecurity last year. It went up 60%. That's expected to grow further this year. People that are facing acute food shortages on the continent. This is going to have huge impacts on political pressures on the continent, and it will be, I think, really seizing a lot of attention for political leaders. So this is going to be a challenge for democracies, and as Nick pointed out, and as history shows us, economic strains pose challenges for autocracies. A lot of the democratic transitions we've seen emerge from economic turmoil. And so, indeed, there are, in the midst of crisis, there may be opportunities on the democratic front. And so this year will be very much a testing year for governance systems across the continent. I think the third point that I would make is that we need to monitor political opportunists. And indeed, because of the distraction, there are risk of coups like we saw in Mali, and frankly, what we're seeing this week in Chad. But more generally, there's been a growing politicization of Africa's militaries in recent years, where because they've grown so close to different ruling parties, as these leaders, as these longtime leaders come to the end of their tenure, rather than that leading to a succession and some sort of democratic transition, we're seeing militaries step effectively carry on the regime. This is what they're trying to do in Chad. It follows, patterns we saw in Egypt, in Zimbabwe, Algeria, Burundi, and so it's a very, I think, frightening development where not only have we seen a perpetuation of big man rule, but we're seeing a perpetuation and a elongation of regime rule in a number of these governments that have been in power for decades. And COVID, because of the distractions that it's posed internationally and regionally, is creating more of an open playing field for these types of actions. So we leave it at that, and happy to pick up further strands of this in our conversation.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for those introductory remarks. I have to mention that unfortunately, Mr. Dieselele has technical problems in connecting with us. We await eventual eradication of this, and every time we intend to give him a floor. But now I'd like to ask a few questions. First is to Mr. Driss El-Kaissi. For quite a long time already in previous legislature of the European Parliament, I engaged in assessment of the African countries dealing with radicalization of their societies and combating extremism. In this respect, the experience of Morocco was quite important. And I would like to ask Mr. El-Kaissi how pandemics changes this activity. Do you see increased influence of radical ideas, narratives, and how you manage to combat this, to reverse this process?
Yes, thank you, Madam. Yes, I have to say that the pandemic impact the moving of attention to the internet. So you have more offers of radicalism in the internet, and they have justification on some cases that are discussed in some country, like France, for example. There is a new law on which is called against separatism, and Muslims in general consider as it is just trying to persecute them. And the issue now with the extreme right that give arguments to those radicalists in Africa, mainly in Muslim countries. So we have to say that, as I said, the drawing attention is more given to internet, and this kind of speeches, radicalist speech, are really expanding during the pandemic, and they could attend the people that they want to attend. So what Morocco try to do. Just try also to work on internet, on speeches, and try to have some influencers, Moroccans or Africans, in order to pass some message in order to help fighting the radicalization process. I don't want to elaborate on what Morocco is doing. It's a general policy that you know, Madam Fotyga. But for the pandemic, as I said, more attention is done in Morocco on the internet, more focus.
Mm-hmm. Professor Cheeseman, as all of us observed the actions by PRC, by China, at the very beginning of pandemic, actually the measures taken internally by authoritarian regime appeared after some time quite successful, and this country was able to promote the effectiveness of combating terrorism. Generally speaking, majority of African states are not particularly, or have been not particularly strong in terms of institutions, and pandemics is simply special type of crisis situation there, where it is extremely important to provide public services to people, in particular healthcare. There are countries, and in terms of success, Malawi was mentioned. So strong democracies are also more efficient in providing solutions to existing pandemics, but not necessarily. This picture is still quite diluted. What do you think about our ability to engage in Africa, with Africa, in assisting countries in basing needs of population? Of course, the eventual post-pandemic crisis is also important factor to this picture.
Thanks. I think there's a couple of really interesting points there. You know, one is about are democracies or authoritarian regimes doing better in managing the pandemic, and then the second is, you know, how can we support African governments in terms of healthcare and building out of the pandemic. On the first point, I mean, I think it's very clear that you can have excellent pandemic response in authoritarian and non-authoritarian states. We have a small number of authoritarian states that have performed particularly well once the pandemic started. We also have some democracies that have performed particularly well once the pandemic started. It's not a straight line. I think one thing, though, that is worth noting is that most of the problems that have been longest coming and taken the longest to resolve have been in authoritarian regimes led by populists, usually men, who have rejected the idea of scientific responses. So if you think about places like Tanzania, like places like Brazil, like places like Madagascar, where presidents have either kind of put forward their own herbal cures, or where we've seen a kind of rejection of Western science, you know, the problem in those countries is that the absence of strong democratic measures has meant you haven't been able to challenge or remove those presidents. And so the authoritarian mistakes of the government become self-reproducing. Of course, sadly, in the Tanzanian case, it took the death of President Magufuli to end that policy. Although still, Tanzania has not adopted many of the best practice examples from around the world. The one good thing about democracy is that when leaders make really bad decisions, you can get rid of them. And the United States is a great example. The US was in a terrible situation. It had a leader that rejected COVID science. It got rid of that leader, and now it's one of the countries around the world that has the highest proportion of its population vaccinated. So I think it's really important to realize that the benefit of democracy is not that democracies always get it right at the beginning, but that the people can kick out the government if the government's not performing and bring in a better one. And I do think we need to keep in mind that some of the real disasters around the world in terms of responding to COVID have come under authoritarian regimes that don't have accountability mechanisms. On your very, the final point you made, of course, we know that many African governments have responded particularly well. Really early lockdowns and effective lockdowns, keeping borders closed, trying to monitor people and track and trace very effectively. In some Southern African states, kept cases very low. In countries like Malawi, we're down to 20 or 30 cases a day. Compare that to what's happening in India or the UK or the US, it's still very impressive. But absolutely, we need to invest more in healthcare systems around the world, both to help those countries, but also because that's a rational policy of self-benefit for ourselves. It will help to deal with future pandemics if we have better health systems in countries in Africa and in Asia. One of the things that is therefore really worrying is to see that the UK government, for example, my government, cut spending on aid at exactly the wrong moment. We've had a massive cut in foreign aid at exactly the time when countries in Africa and elsewhere most need our support, both to bolster democracy, but also to increase spending on healthcare. Now, we've actually seen an increase in foreign aid overall over the last year, mainly because of positive moves by other European countries and by America itself. But I think one of the things that we all need to keep in mind is that if we care about healthcare of ourselves and of other people, and if we care about democracy, then we have to step up to the plate and we have to keep those financial options available for countries. Otherwise, we are going to be part of the reason why things get worse in the next few years rather than better.
Thank you. In our title, we speak as well about human rights, about fundamental freedoms. Dr. Siegle, vaccination is limited good in actually all over the world. At the very beginning of pandemic, it was clear shortage of vaccine almost everywhere. Some countries already overcome this situation, but surely in Africa, the demand for vaccine is much higher than supply of this medicine. Do you think there is a way of violating fundamental freedoms or human rights by providing of vaccines within individual countries? So it is also the matter, do you see it as a pattern of internal policies? Is it visible or not yet?
Well, I think it's too early to say with any, confidence that we're seeing this systematic, denial of access to vaccines to particular groups. I think that's something we'll certainly want to keep an eye on. I think, the bigger question is, to recognize this is a global public health challenge, and so there is a both a moral but a public health need to get as many people in Africa vaccinated as quickly as possible, and so there's going to need to be a major effort at cooperation on this to roll out the vaccination campaigns as they ramp up. Again, drawing on the lessons from the Spanish flu, the second and third waves were often more virulent because there were mutations, and the longer the virus incubates, the more opportunities there'll be for mutations that can be even more contagious and deadly. we're seeing some of this already, with the variants that have emerged. And so it's an imperative that we will move at breakneck speed to get these vaccination campaigns ramped up. I think Africa has a bit of an advantage compared to other parts of the world in that there's a lot of experience with vaccination campaigns, still very active and reaching all parts of the population. And so you have already established public health and community health worker networks that can they have the trust of local communities and have the and can reach them. I think the challenges will be logistically, especially with some of these vaccines requiring the super cold temperatures to keep the vaccines viable, and being able to reach people under those circumstances. But I do, I do feel like this is going to be a real imperative for Europe and the United States and other leaders in the global commons to really invest in helping ramp up the vaccination efforts on the continent. And there's already been some pretty good cooperation. I think Africa's public health systems have done a pretty good job, and within the limitations that they face. And so I think what will be really important is having those plans ready to roll out. I think it's really important on the communications front to educate the populations about what's coming, to try to allay fears. We've seen this as being a big challenge in other vaccination campaigns when misinformation creates fear and a rejection of being vaccinated. And we're seeing this, of course, in the United States and in Europe and other parts of the world as well. So I think proactively trying to educate the population will be an important part of that. But then logistically, being able to roll out plans that are going to reach as many people as quickly as possible is important. And frankly, I think, again, we saw the US and Europe not as prepared for their vaccination rollout plans as they could have been. I think this is the time that Africa really needs to have those plans in place so that as the supply ramps up, we'll be able to get more of those vaccinations out to the population.
Thank you. Consul Kaissi, it was quite important for Morocco to engage in enhancing the regional cooperation within Africa and beyond. Actually, we perceived this activity in many of sub-regions of the continent as enhancing the economic development of nations and whole continent. How this situation, pandemic situation, challenges those processes, and in your opinion, how can we help in this respect to maintain links and to keep them? Yeah. Do you hear me?
So, hello, you hear me now?
Yes, I do.
Yes, so thank you, Madam. Yes, as has been said, the pandemic has its impact, but we have to say that there are structural problems. They are here since long time. So Morocco we have to say that the pandemic, it has also some opportunities. There is for us, there is not only bad things.
Yeah.
Some opportunities, like for the production of the masks at the beginning, it was an opportunity for Morocco, and we could convert some industries, textile industry for masks, and we could help our African friends in giving them the masks that time. Now there are also some innovations dealing with this bad situation. With Africa, we have to say that there are already some cooperation, South-South cooperation that we are dealing with in Africa. We have some programs related to agriculture, small agriculture plants, and using renewable energy. So we could manage some situation, mainly in some countries with a very big population like Ethiopia and Nigeria. With Nigeria also, we have a plan for a new gasoduct and gas plane. And now with the pandemic, we have to say that the impact is negative because we could not go ahead for this kind of projects. So Morocco, as I said, we are also trying to help with our trilateral cooperation with Europe and Africa. We are trying to play this role as a gateway between the two continents. But we have to say that from Europe, this experience, we have to say that at the beginning, between the speeches and the practice, there is so differences, and we see even between Europeans there is no this cooperation that we expected. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I am aware of this energy project starting from Nigeria and being very much engaged in energy security issues on European level. I have also my reservations, but I understand your point. Professor Cheeseman, well, actually, within the EU, we certainly limited, at least at European Parliament level, we certainly limited our election observation activity. Many of us contributed to really meticulous observation of elections. Thanks to this, European Parliament was able to provide reliable data on the situation and also engage in advisory actions between elections. Now, pandemics certainly limited influence of international community on those processes, not only in Africa, but also in many other regions. Hopefully, with combating pandemic, we'll be able to restart our activity and make some change also in this. Actually, even before pandemic, the existing tendency to increase the length of staying in government was quite popular. Do you see? You already mentioned this kind of processes. actually, we see that with coup d'etat here in Mali and also in other places, we may see the freezing of tendencies to stay in power and limit influence of opposition on political scene in many countries. What is your observation? I think that it is important to note.
Well, I think one of the things that we hopefully will do after the pandemic is, build back better and see if we can actually develop strategies to strengthen some of the things that we were doing before the pandemic. I think election observation, which, as you said, the European Union has led on over the last sort of 15 years and is one of the prominent observers in many African countries, is one of those areas. We need observers, and observers do a very difficult job. And at the minute, I think a lot of observers are a bit nervous because they go to elections and they do what they think of as a very solid job, but then they find that they become the object of controversy. Think about Kenya, think about Malawi, where observers were seen to have pulled their punches and then the courts overturned the results. So I think there's a couple of things, that we perhaps want to do. I mean, one is, I think we maybe want to start thinking about, are there ways in which observers can, be a bit more effective perhaps before the polls? Do we actually need to empower and encourage our observation groups to say more before elections when they start to see the conditions deteriorating? Related to that, do we actually need to see more observation groups refusing to deploy if they think there's no way the elections can be a good quality? We've seen that in a couple of cases recently, partly due to COVID-19, but in a couple of cases also, I think, there was a reluctance of international observers to deploy teams because they felt that they would end up legitimating processes that were probably going to be flawed. And I think that's a very difficult question, the question of deciding not to actually observe and therefore to kind of call out an election 2 or 3 months ahead of time. But in cases where we see, hundreds of opposition supporters being detained, opposition leaders being harassed, really repressive legislation, mass censorship, maybe we should be saying there's no point in going and observing this election. This is a flawed process and we need to not legitimize it. I think the third thing that, we perhaps want to talk about a bit more is, how can we strengthen both international and domestic observers? I mean, one of the things we've seen over the last few years is that there's an increasing ability to manipulate processes digitally, especially with a number of elections now having significant electronic components. And we also see, the reality is that authoritarian leaders are getting smarter. I published a book called How to Rig an Election a couple of years ago, and we documented the sort of more sophisticated strategies being used by presidents to manipulate elections in many parts of the world. And so I think one of the things we really need to ask is the old model of election observation going to work? The old model is send 150 people max out across a country, put them in polling stations, have them report back and have a team in the capital city doing kind of prominent elite interviews. Well, that's not really a very effective way of actually detecting the kinds of manipulation that we're now seeing. So perhaps we need international observers to focus more on specialized skills like digital processes, monitoring social media, monitoring electoral manipulation and digital manipulation of electoral registers and so on. And perhaps we need to focus more on empowering domestic observers, which, let's face it, are the only organizations can actually observe elections in a comprehensive way at multiple polling stations across the whole country, as a way of actually kind of specializing. So domestic observers provide much more comprehensive coverage. International observers perhaps become more specialized and focus on new mechanisms of electoral manipulation. Either way, I think it's clear that observation is essential and important, but we need to empower observers. At the minute, they don't have the resources or the tools to be able to cope with the new strategies of manipulation that leaders are using.
Thank you very much indeed. Elaborating on what you already presented, Professor Cheeseman, I would like to ask Dr. Siegle also a question referring to global players' influence. The African society or Society of African States is considerably young, and quite efficient in using technological novelties. The influence of PRC China in this area, in IT and 4G, eventually later 5G is overwhelming when we look in continental policies. Do you think this situation may in future influence the electoral patterns of Africa? Is it worth observing nowadays?
I think it is an issue. Clearly China has been actively involved in building up Africa's digital infrastructure, and in the process helping to disseminate and normalize surveillance technology. And this has been adopted by a number of authoritarian governments, which has helped to limit civil liberties and political rights. So it is a concern. I think, importantly, we need to recognize it's not just China that is selling and promoting the surveillance technology. There's a number of Western companies involved as well. And perhaps more importantly,
Yes,
the issue is that there's complicity among African leaders who are happy to take the surveillance technology and use it for their own political purposes. And so I think, yes, we need to talk about this technology, but we also need to talk about the legal framework in which it's being deployed, and to strengthen the legal restrictions and the limitations that can be invoked to make sure that citizen interests are being protected in the process. And I think more generally, that is the concern with growing influence of China and Russia on the continent. They're very much approaching their governance model in a top-down manner. They're supporting the effective co-option of African leaders, and in the process sidelining African citizens from their own political systems. That works so long as there isn't accountability. And indeed, we've seen a lot of impunity in Africa in recent years. I would say it's growing in recent years. And so the question is, how do you increase accountability? How do you hold leaders accountable when they're signing contracts that benefit themselves and external actors at the expense of their population? So, how do we improve transparency? How do we improve greater citizen oversight of these processes? So whether it be the technology, whether it be natural resource deals, whether it be infrastructure deals, trying to advance and empower citizen groups so that they have a say and can increase accountability for their leaders, I think is real critical. And that applies to the election processes that we were just talking about as well. It's great to have observers, but we're finding African leaders are happy to steal elections with or without observers. And even when there's boycotts, that doesn't slow them down from having an election and declaring themselves winners. And so there has to be some cost for that. Somebody who secures a victory by sidelining opposition doesn't deserve the same level of legitimacy and support from Europe and the international community as somebody who has gone through a genuine contestation process. And so I think trying to enhance those measures of accountability should be a real priority for Europe and engaging Africa moving forward.
I would like to, towards the end of our panel, I would like to raise the issue of terrorism in Africa that was visible, painful phenomenon there in many countries. We witnessed insurgencies, civil wars, active actions of variety of radical terrorist groups. I think that overall picture or eventual influence of pandemics on activity of terrorist groups is not quite clear, because there are some cases where those groups like Al-Shabaab engage in providing individual goods like face masks, but there are predominantly continued actions and even increased attacks of terrorist groups. What is your reflection on this? I know also that variety of groups try to introduce their own narratives wherever and whenever we have combating, for example, French influence. It is blaming French government for everything. Wherever there is inter-religious combat, we have narratives like punishment of the god to the other part of society. What is your reflection on the state of play of eventual achievements of terrorist groups and further destabilizing situation of whole regions and individual states? Starting with, now maybe we reverse the order from Dr. Siegle.
Okay, I'm happy to go first. So I agree that it isn't a clear-cut pattern that we have seen. I would characterize the influences as that, you know, we've seen a ramp up of violent extremist groups really for the past decade. You know, across 5 main theaters in Africa, in Somalia, like you mentioned, the Lake Chad Basin, Sahel, Egypt, and then now Mozambique. And we've seen increases in violent extremist activity in each of those, save Egypt, where we've seen a plateau in recent years. And so I think, you know, violent extremists are using COVID as another opportunity where governments are distracted and having to stretch their resources to try to advance their interest. But those, you know, the drivers between violent extremist activity, you know, they're unrelated to COVID, and you know, they're taking advantage of weakened government infrastructure to do so. You know, it's a big challenge, and I would note, you know, there are 4 democratizing countries that are facing violent extremist insurgencies right now. In Niger, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Mozambique, and so it is very much adding to the strain that they are facing in delivering services to their population, to delivering protection and security to their populations, and in the process being seen as a responsible and legitimate leadership. It was the narrative that the Malian government was not able to provide security, that spoilers and really usurpers of power in the military were able to deploy to conduct the coup in Mali. And so I do think you know, violent extremism is a growing problem that is going to need a multidimensional response there's a security dimension to it, sure, but at the core, you know, these violent extremist groups are weak, but resilient threats, and they're having most impact in fragile states with weak governments. And so I think as Europe and the international community looks at engaging, the idea is how can you strengthen those governments, those, you know, the legitimacy of those governments, the capacity of those governments to provide services that will help to stem the tide and reverse the threat that we're seeing.
Thank you. Professor Cheeseman, same question. Sorry. Could you please activate
Apologies.
your... Oh, okay.
Apologies. I was saying that I think Joe did a fantastic job answering that question. I think we're running out of time, so I'll forego mine and just add support to all of the excellent points that he made.
Thank you. Consul Kaissi, would you like
Yes, Madam. Just what I would like to say that this network of terrorism, we consider it as part of all the networks, and we should think about developing more the continent, mainly this area where there are terrorists. Because, as has been said, this protection within the population make the issue more difficult. And this population, because of their poverty, they just follow for some revenue. So we think that if we could have a big project of development in this area where there is a harbor of terrorists, we could deal with that, and we should not just focus on security purpose, but try on parallel to resolve the issue of development in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, with this topic, I would like to conclude this very important and interesting topic and our panel. It is the end of whole webinar hosted on behalf of the ECR group by Asita Kanko, MEP, and myself. I would like to thank all distinguished panelists for their participation today, for very valuable remarks. Surely we would like to continue assessment of the situation in Africa. We intend to organize the physical summit EU-Africa, led by the ECR group within the European Parliament in near future. Unfortunately, it is the second time we have to rely on remote connection, but we look forward to combating COVID all over the world and returning to our normal way of proceeding. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for this panel, for this conference. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.